There's more local news at staffordfm.co.uk.
Good evening. Welcome to Stafford Town Football Club on this very special broadcast for Stafford FM. My name is Richard Bishop. I'm here to chair and present a debate with the candidates for the forthcoming election here in Stafford, all vying for your vote to be the next Stafford MP. I'll get the panellists to introduce themselves. Jeremy first.
Good evening. Thanks very much indeed for hosting this. My name's Jeremy.
Thank you. Kate?
Hi everyone, hi Rich. I'm Kate Godfrey. I'm standing for Labour here next year. I worked overseas for many years after growing up in Staffordshire and decided to get into politics when I came back needing the hospital and went, oh dear.
Thank you. And finally to Karen.
I'm Karen Howell. I'm with the National Health Action Party and also Fight for Stafford. By training, I was a nurse and a health visitor, and I've been involved with the health and social services since.
Thank you very much, and thank you for all of you for joining us. The questions tonight have come from listeners of Stafford FM or from the audience assembled here tonight at Stafford Town Football Club on Riverside. And so I will present the questions that have been sent in from the listeners, and the members of the public who are here tonight can present their own questions. To begin with, a topic of the economy. From the listeners, several questions have been asked around this. How can you, as an individual, provide better employment opportunities for Stafford? How can Stafford attract more high street stores instead of just pounded charity shops? And how will we, as Stafford, compete in the current economic climate? And what do you propose will help Stafford move with the times? And to follow on from that, a question from Adam Aspin.
At the moment, employment is fortunately going up, unemployment down. How will any of the candidates, if elected, make sure this trend continues?
So, wide area of the economy. So, employment opportunities, how will we keep the current trends going? How will we attract more high street stores? And how do you propose that Stafford's going to compete? Jeremy, if I can put that to you first.
Well, thanks very much. I think we've seen some good progress in Stafford over the last few years. There's still an awful long way to go. We've seen the number of job seekers allowance claimants fall by half over the last 4 years to about 750 in the constituency, but that's still too many. What do we need to do in the future? Well, firstly, I believe we need to ensure, sometimes we forget about the businesses that we already have. We tend to think, well, it's great to attract new businesses into the area. First of all, we've got to make sure that those businesses that we have, the very strong ones, stay here and grow here. So, for instance, Alstom, which is, as you probably know, going to be taken over by a joint venture between General Electric of the US and Alstom next year. We need to ensure that they have the right environment to continue to invest here. They've won some excellent orders in recent months and years, a £600 million one most recently. They're doing an awful lot of work in Sweden and indeed around the world. In fact, most of their products go for exports, which helps the UK balance of payments. And the number of people working there has gone up. They are taking on more apprentices. But what we need to do is make sure that we listen to what they say about the location. If they need extra space, we need here in Stafford to be able to help them on that. And there are other local companies such as Perkins, which, as you know, is part of Caterpillar Group, which are also expanding, taking on more people. So that's existing companies. But then we need to encourage new companies both to set up locally and to come into the area. I was very pleased that a company I visited a few weeks ago was set up in Stafford, I think in the mid-2000s, and is now employing 100 people and hopes to employ 300 people within 3 or 4 years. And they are local people paying excellent salaries. Unfortunately, I lost one of my members of staff to them because they could offer him a better job than I could. But that's great. That's important, giving local people lots of opportunities. But then I think we've got to look at skills. We have a real shortage of skills in the whole of the UK and indeed here. We look at companies like Alstom, and they are having to go overseas for recruitment, particularly of engineers. And we must continue to focus on skills. The number of apprentices in the constituency has doubled in the last 4 or 5 years, but we need to do more on that. We need to have higher apprentices, higher apprenticeships. Just coming finally to the issue of the town centre. I checked the figures, and absolutely we must have no complacency over this, but Stafford, in terms of vacancies in the town centre, we're well below the national average, because almost every town centre across the country, except for those which are in particularly in tourist locations like York, for instance, have had this problem. They are affected by internet trading, which has seen them lose 15 or 20% of their business in some cases. What we need to do, I believe, is continue to look at things like parking. We need to ensure that we are talking with the major retailers as well as encouraging other local retailers to get in. I'm very encouraged that, for instance, Marks and Spencer want to expand here, that we're getting Primark in. But of course, there's a big question about the north end of the town. What will happen when Marks and Spencers go down there? What's going to the south end? What's going to happen to the Guildhall? We must look at this very, very carefully. And although people often mention charity and pound shops, let's not forget that they also perform a very valuable service. I mean, a lot of our local charities, Catherine House, depend on, to some extent, on the income raised from those. So what we should be looking at is not so much them, but the actual vacancies. What do we do with those 9% of vacancies that we have here? Although, as I say, that compares with about 13% nationwide. So those are just a few areas that I believe we need to concentrate on.
It actually sounds like quite a positive outlook from where you are at the moment.
Positive, but certainly not complacent. We need to see increases in levels of wages across the country. That's something that a lot of people have said it is a problem. We are beginning to see them go up, but we need to see more of that, and we also need to see higher value jobs. I mean, we've got this whole issue of the university site, which is going to be vacated in 2 years' time. We're looking at how that can be developed. The university originally wanted housing there. The Borough Council, quite rightly, is absolutely opposed to that. We need to make that into a high-value employment site. One thing we're looking at the moment, for instance, is with the Technology Strategy Board, whether we have one of these catapult centres. So we're bidding for a catapult centre for the energy systems catapult. That would be fantastic if we got that. But obviously, we're up against a lot of competition from places like Sheffield, Birmingham and Manchester.
Of course. Karen, if I can put the same questions to you around the economy and jobs, what would you do in the same situation? How do you keep your current trends going?
Well, from my point of view, you don't shut the hospital or downgrade the hospital. That's instantly where I would start. I think there's been an absolute impact on public health services, and these are where vital jobs are in that way. There's also some over the years, some really quite serious aspects been happening, like with outsourcing. You know, I've had sons go through this process, and I've seen their friends as well. And you've got this insidious outsourcing going on, whereby to large companies, so they're not bringing, value or quality or loyalty or job security for a lot of people in the town. Instead, it's actually going more as profits into sort of larger companies, not investing in this town, which actually is very important. The other thing I'm seeing is where you've got, in the health and social care sector, as well as in some of the public, not the public services, some of the larger companies, whereby people are not on a proper wage. That, we need to have the living wage. And I see again in a lot of these sort of skilled or semi-skilled jobs, people are on zero contract hours, which is absolutely ridiculous. And also people are, they're on agency work. There's no security. These people have families. They have children to support, and yet they have no job security. So I think there's a lot to be amended here. As for the town, I'm really sad at what's happened to Stafford. I came here 15 years ago. We had a thriving town. What's happened to it? Why is this happening? And I have to say, we're looking in large in part at the austerity measures that are going on. They are crippling our society. They're crippling people in their daily lives. And they're also crippling our ability to actually provide and promote industry in the town. I believe in enterprise. I'm a strong believer of manufacturing. We lost this. We began to lose it 30 years ago, and over the years it's continued. We have to invest in smaller companies. They're a backbone of society, not, certainly with the bigger ones and the smaller ones. We need to be more creative in how we look at the shops in the town. I'm really worried. We've got shops like the the loaners, these pay loan companies. I've seen about 4 or 5, I think, in Stafford open up. What on earth are these doing coming to Stafford? So it begins to reflect what's going on. Give the young people a chance. The Borough Council, the council should be looking at actually reducing business rates. Get enterprise back in. Get young people. Get the creativity. Make it a place that becomes interesting again to shop. And also, it needs a really good look at the North End, because I'm really concerned about that area and upon businesses in that area, because they're going to see a shortfall in the footfall. And that's what we don't want. We need to actually seriously work, consult, talk to the traders, because they will have ideas on how to promote business too. And we mustn't forget them.
I suppose if you were to be given a magic wand, if you like, and given the power to do one thing in particular, what would you be doing?
I think it's investment in smaller companies and local people. And just that's where I would go.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And to you, Kate, same question.
Jeremy said he isn't complacent. I think that sounded really complacent. You know, in the Labour group, we're expecting Stafford to go Labour next year, and so we're campaigning really hard. And we speak to people on their doorstep every weekend in this town. And over the last 2 months, we've spoken to an average of 4 people every weekend who have lost their jobs within the last 2 weeks before we've spoken to them. Now, I know the employment figures are going up nationally, but that's actually not the case in Stafford. What has happened is we've had some people forced into working for free on work programme. We've had some people who've been taken off the figures, so they're not recorded. We've had people taken out of the benefits system, but that doesn't mean that they're not having a tough time. Only 16% of people in this town think that they have job security. 16% of people think that it is getting better already. So it is complacent to say that we don't have a problem here. Now let's look at the type of jobs we've got. And on this, Karen is absolutely right. We've seen a real trend towards the employment that's actually not necessarily the employment we want. And when Jeremy says it's great that GE are coming in, can we remember that GE are the company that pioneered the practice in the UK whereby you fire everyone in your workforce on day 364 just before they get employment rights? I don't think that's the type of job necessarily, the type of practice that we want to see coming into Stafford. Now, Perkins, they're a great local company, but they have 70% agency staff. And when I spoke to someone recently, he said to me, it's got to a point now where I've got some mental health problems, because what I want to do is I want to move on with my life. What I want to do is I want to buy a house. I want to settle down. I want to start a family. But because I'm not sure that my work is going to persist because of the type of contract I'm on, I don't think I can take that risk. And actually, I think that's a real shame. There are huge opportunities in Stafford in terms of job creation here. There are lots of things we could explore. The first thing we need to get sorted is the logistics and the infrastructure around the town so we can start to grow. But at the moment, it's not happening, and it's not going to happen for a good while yet. So let's not be complacent about it. Let's focus on helping people. And let's focus on the 300 jobs that are about to be lost at the hospital, on the jobs that are being lost at the university. Let's talk about the 10 jobs that were lost last week in the MOD. Let's talk about the 10 jobs that were lost on the high street last week. Let's talk to these people and let's help them through the difficulty that they're having. And then we can start to talk about a bright new future. And then let me talk about the high street as well. Karen asked, what about the pay loans companies? Well, what about them? Yeah, vacancy rates on Stafford High Street, they're about the average across the UK. But where we have real problems is if when you go into those shops and you say to them, were you a permanent sale shop 2 years ago? Were you a discounting outlet? Were you a pawnbrokers? Were you a pay for loans company? What happened? And they'll say to you, well, we've had real problems because people can't come into the town centre. We have a beautiful town centre in Stafford, but it's very hard to get through. We have a traffic problem, which is, I'm sure we're going to talk about it. And Labour councillors are already looking about what we do about that next year when we've got some authority over this. And we've got big plans for the high street. The first one of them is to start to give the Borough Council the power to say, we don't want another pawnbrokers and we don't want another play loans company. The next thing is the ability to cut business rates for the kind of businesses, for young businesses, for people from Stafford who are looking at building something. That's really important. So that's a change we're going to make. And slowly but surely we will revitalise that. But I think we've got to talk about Riverside in this. We have a new development coming up, which is only going to increase the traffic problems around the town centre. As far as I can tell, they're not worrying about that in the slightest. The contract for Riverside seems to have been given to a company that isn't a taxpayer in this country. And I think that brings you exactly back to jobs. Are those the type of companies that we want here?
I think there's a very popular view at the moment that the situation the economy's in, it happened during Labour's watch, should we say. Is that a view you would share? Does Labour have the answers to take you out of it?
The economy was growing in 2010. Since then, the deficit has climbed. George Osborne has added more to national debt than every Labour chancellor added together for the whole of history. So that's the kind of problems we've got. He's not met any of his targets. The recovery we've had through this economy is the slowest recovery we've had since the South Sea bubble, more than 200 years. All economies recover. What happens is you decline, and because your economy's got smaller, it gets easier to grow from the smaller base you're moving from. We should have been in recovery 3 to 4 years ago. We should be where the States is now. Actually, I'm with Karen on this too. We should have had an investment-led economy. Austerity was not the answer, and we are not where we ought to be now.
I think, Jeremy, to bring you back in, obviously, Karen and Kate have done a bit of pointing at the current government. Obviously, you are a representative of that. Is there anything you'd like to say in return?
Well, I'd like to point out, first of all, that we have been, and the whole world, particularly Europe, has been in an incredibly difficult situation since 2008. It was the deepest crisis since the 20s, possibly in percentage terms even more than that. We were faced with a £150+ billion deficit. It's coming down. It's not come down enough. It needs to go down further. We're at about £95 billion this year, which is still a great deal. It's in percentage terms, in percentage of the economy, it's come down by more than half. Now, in terms of investment, clearly, it's extremely difficult when you're facing such a deficit that you continue the levels of investment you had before. In fact, the levels of investment that this government has undertaken are roughly the same levels as were forecast by the previous government, and we've maintained those. I look at Stafford, and I want to point again to the investment, for instance, that we're making in the Ministry of Defence, which is more than £150 million. But it's not just that one-off investment. It's the fact that we will have 1,000 additional servicemen and women coming. They will bring into the economy probably 15 to 20 million pounds a year, and I expect we're going to see considerable impact on that. I said right at the beginning, and I absolutely stress this, and I am in no way complacent. I very much understand the difficult times that a lot of people have gone through and continue to go through, and that's why we have to make a real effort on things like wages, 0 hours contracts. There are some really sharp practices around, which is why this government is bringing in a bill to tackle some of the worst practices on 0 hours contracts. But at the same time, we live in a global economy, and the global economy is in difficulty. We see what's happening in the Eurozone, where there's almost no growth at the moment. We see a slowdown in China. And we are finding that we have to compete around the world. And we also have to remember that, and Karen quite rightly talked about the decline in manufacturing. That is now beginning to turn round, but we are at a pretty low point. It went as low as 10% of GDP. It's beginning to climb, but not fast enough. We have a big trade deficit, the highest, in fact, in the G8, which we need to turn around, because we cannot go on living on, if you like, borrowing money from other people for our imports. We need to increase our exports. To increase our exports, we need to be competitive. Stafford has a lot of very good exporters, which I'm very proud of, as I've said, Alstom and Alstom GE. And GE, I mean, I've been talking with a colleague of mine from Rugby, where GE have been investors for some time, and he rates them highly in terms of what they do. Now, let's see what happens. I want to work very closely with GE and Alstom in the joint venture, because it's absolutely critical that for them. They're our biggest employers in the private sector. They employ 2,000 people. But yes, there's absolutely no complacency, and I would never say that in the slightest. But on the other hand, I think it's extremely important that we celebrate the successes of a lot of small businesses around here that have grown substantially and are really sticking to Stafford and employing Stafford people.
That was we need, I want. You've had 4 years. That sounds like an admission of failure.
So when I became MP in 2010, there were just over 1,500 people on job seekers allowance. There's now about 750.
And now they're working for free in Tesco's and in Asda.
Well, no, that's not true at all.
Do those contracts not exist? Does the work programme not exist in Stafford today?
Of course it exists, and of course there are people who, in my view, exploit the situation, and that's why we're bringing in legislation on 0 hours contracts. I too share. Karen mentioned the living wage, and I share an aspiration for that as well. I think it's extremely important that we move towards that.
Karen, any reply from you?
Well, I was saying I was quite enjoying that. It's the battle out between the two parties. Basically, I think we need to get real. I think we need to seriously look at people and what the opportunities are. I think we need to talk to people. We need to talk to people that have been unemployed. We need to talk to people that are unemployed. There are several programs I completely dislike that I've been seeing as well, and I agree with the internships. I think they're quite, it's more like slave labour with some young people. And I think if we're going to move forward, we need to invest in Stafford. We need to actually really promote on the business side, the smaller businesses, and get manufacturing back. I think that's where the emphasis is. But the trouble is, the banks, who we've actually bailed out, won't lend to small businesses. So there needs to be some real direction in where we target here. You know, are we supporting bankers and other aspects like that, other corporations? Or are we going to really tackle? And I think the Conservative government, I have to say, has not done enough on this. And it needs to be something that's addressed.
I think we're going to bring you back to a major local issue in a moment, but just say to any listeners at home at the moment, just as a matter of course, we're not going to any adverts at all. We are here live for the whole hour. We are also on social media as well. So if you're on our Facebook page or Twitter page, do get in touch, and we are trying to canvass opinion from you while we're on air. I'm going to bring it to a local issue now, and it's quite a hot topic, which I didn't really want to open with. I'm going to hand to a guest who's in the studio at the moment, sorry, in the room at the moment, Paul Wilson, former Mid-Staffs Community Health Council Hospital Group Chair. Hope I got that right, Paul. Who I believe has a letter that he'd like to.
Well, it's a piece I'd like to read and then ask for comment in turn, please. In listening the other day to the plans of the Chief Executive of UHNS for the future accommodation of patients at Stafford Hospital, I picture patients on understaffed wards in single-bedded bays, mostly unobserved, injuring themselves in trying to get up unassisted, requiring avoidable further treatment at best, and at worst, the unthinkable. And having spent many months at the Second Francis inquiry into past circumstances at our hospital, I cannot help wondering if we are headed that way again. Could I please have that answered in order? Kate first, then Karen, and then Jeremy, please.
That's made my job a lot easier. To you first, Kate.
Thanks for that, Paul. What I don't want to do is to frighten people about the quality of care that they're going to depend on next year. But we're all frightened, and with reason, because when an A&E was closed in Newark last year, straight away there was a tangible impact on the outcomes for patients who were being put on the roads. So yeah, it's a reality. And it isn't just about the people who are going to be shipped 20 miles, although that's going to be incredibly traumatic for them. This is what is happening to the hospital is part of a general attack on our health service here in Staffordshire, which now includes the privatisation of cancer services, which will be 1 in 2 of us by 2020 will have a cancer diagnosis in our lifetime. It includes selling off mental health care. It includes selling off sexual health care. It includes up to 100% cuts of our social and our care facilities. It involves people who are in permanent residential care at the moment being told that they have a choice between going home, finding an option of their own, or being left with no option at all because the county council is not interested. Now, we know that the attack on the health service and on the NHS, it isn't just us here in Staffordshire. Oliver Letwin, Conservative minister, famously said that the NHS wouldn't exist within 5 years of a Conservative victory. And you know what? In Staffordshire, we're closer to that than they are anywhere else in any other county of the UK. It started with the hospital, and we know why our hospital was chosen, because it was an easy target for a programme of closure of district and general local hospitals that was intended to take place across the country. As soon as the judicial review that we brought was knocked out of court, because the government who was sponsoring this changed judicial review law to make sure they didn't face another embarrassment of the type they faced in Lewisham, we knew that we were going to see the house of cards fall, and we were going to see hospital after hospital told that this will affect them now. And that's what's happening. We're hearing about A&E after A&E closing. They are talking about a fundamentally different model of healthcare. Now, UHNS caters to a population of 3 million people. And when I look at what's been done to Stafford Hospital, I look to UHNS, as we all do, and we say, do you have a choice in this? And the reality is they don't. They were told, you've got to come in, you've got to take this over because the government want it closed, because they want a success, they want a precedent, they want a big building which is no longer financially viable, and we will look with interest to see what happens on that next. But the truth is that UHNS are in severe financial difficulty. The cancer privatisation, which is the biggest privatisation in NHS history.
We'll come back to that if that's okay.
Sure.
It's a separate question.
The first ever £1 billion privatisation. That is going to take nearly £50 million a year. That's the amount of UHNS care that this affects. Private companies going to get to tell them that they have to bring their prices down, that they're going to have less money at UHNS. So why do they need Stafford? Why do they need the £250 million that the government is prepared to spend to see this go through? Because they don't have a choice either. Now, people aren't listening to us in Stafford. They have never listened to us. Our CCG, our local commissioners, say they have consultancy exercises, but there has never been a town that has been so much consulted as Stafford and so little listened to. And the Labour government, on the first day of a Labour government in 2015, we will pass what we are calling the Great NHS Rescue Act. We will do everything that Karen will tell you the NHA party want. We will restore the Secretary of State's duty to provide healthcare in this country. We will restore NHS funding. We will take privatisation. We will take the internal market out of the NHS. We will stop the closures of local hospitals. And we will make sure that the NHS, our fragile but much prized, much loved NHS, starts to grow again. And that day is the whole reason I got into politics. And on that day, we will repeal the law that created CCGs. We will repeal the people locally who have not listened to this town, and we will say to them, your time is up. Commissioning will now belong to people locally, and if they want to have these services back at Stafford Hospital, then that is what we will do.
Karen, to you.
Oh, how long have we got?
Not as long as I think you're going to take.
As some may know, I've been fighting what's happened to our hospital for nearly 3 years now. And that started with the A&E closure and in setting up as well. Well, closure, part-time closure. But at the time, because of my background, I knew, well, that's the thin edge of the wedge, because actually this is where services can go, and seeing what was happening around the country. I'm absolutely appalled. And yes, we haven't been listened to at all by anybody. And I'm including everybody, not properly. And I'm talking all parties here. I think we need to also, part of why am I standing? It's not just the NHS. I look at the history of what's been going on from when I trained as a nurse and a health visitor. I'm looking at the last decades. And actually, both parties have been complicit and actually downsizing, and privatising and marketising the NHS. They've all been involved. And what really annoyed me in Trafalgar Square when I was there, we did have people saying, speakers saying, the NHS will be safe with us. Well, it's not. Because besides what's been said and has been said just now, there are many other aspects there that unless they completely go, then we're still going to have the same old marketisation, because over 13 years after Oliver Letwin and Redmond actually started this whole NHS plan, there's been a plan in place, and this is what they're following. And actually, the Labour government under Blair had the chance to stop it. But no, 13 years, they actually ingrained it further. We saw foundation trusts established, was actually promoting and building the infrastructure for the internal market, a purchaser-provider split, which actually has to be stopped. If they're going to stop it, they've got to completely stop that and actually go right back through the legislation to the beginning. Private finance initiatives. Again, that's another aspect that's insidiously brought in that internal market. That's why UNHS is struggling, as indeed are many other hospitals around the country. Let me add another factor there, and this is where, this government has just added to it, but 10 times over, where, with Stafford Hospital, you've heard it's been bailed out by so much, or so much money has been invested. Well, actually, it hasn't. Out of that 155 million, and I think there's a top up now of an extra 80 million, do you realise it's subject to interest rates? So you've got a mini PFI going on. Now, I followed this through. Where does that money actually go? It actually goes to the Treasury. So that, it's Peter robbing Paul. So this actual investment in the NHS is not happening. It's not on the agenda. They're working to a plan. Going back as well, again, Labour introduced the unsustainable provider regime in 2009. And this artificial insolvency framework we are now faced with, that the TSA have built that process on and monitor. Then we're looking at the promise to repeal the Health and Social Care Act. And restore publicly funded, provided, accountable NHS. European competition law is going to come in. That won't happen. We're still going to get this thing that's TTIP. With TTIP coming in, we're going to actually end up with competition from bigger companies, US companies, because this is the plan. The US corporations are going to come in and take over our NHS and other public services. So we are actually losing out in many ways. There's one other aspect that's here that needs to be mentioned as well, and that's Labour brought in McKinsey, and I've used McKinsey a lot, and in fact there's another player in it. The actual chief executive of NHS England is Simon Stevens. Well, he was actually a special advisor to Blair for many years, so I'm quite intrigued with what he will play out as, because actually he was with a private corporation, and here again we're seeing somebody with that vested interest and links in history coming back into play with us with our health service. So basically, we have something as well called QUIP. That's Quantity, Innovation, Productivity and Prevention. That means, and it was done, this consultation document, just before Labour went out and actually the Tories came in, was it laid the scene? Because they're selling off 2/3 of NHS land. That is part of the plan. At the end of the day, it's people's lives that are going to be affected. On that march, they were saying it's my NHS. But it's not just my NHS. It's our NHS. It's everybody's NHS. And it's not the political party's NHS. So before they start making all these decisions and what they're doing, they need to consult with the people. What do they want? We want the NHS as a public service. In Stafford, I really fear with what's going to happen. We have got a hospital that's downgraded. They're not doing proper assessments, impact assessments. People's lives are going to be lost with this transition process. On the camp, the protest camp we've got outside there, we have people coming in tears, mothers with children, babies as well. How are we going to manage? What about maternity? Maternity in its own right is causing they're going for maternity-led services. We're supposed to have this review. Well, we should actually have the maternity review before any services are transferred, because it's going to put mothers' and babies' lives at risk. The answer to this, Mark Hackett, that doesn't listen to anyone, that's a very good point. He does not listen, is actually got 2 ambulances or ambulances. The ambulances can come. Well, he's a man, isn't he? He doesn't have any idea what it is to have a baby. I mean, when you are in difficulty with labour, the last thing you want to do is be transported from one hospital 23 miles if the M6 is working, and then go and deliver in the hospital. This is going to put lives at significant risk, and it has to be stopped. And I will continue with that protest camp. They're going to have to go over our dead bodies in order to actually move us from that protest. We will have Stafford back. Therefore, that's why I have stood, because I don't trust the parties. They play this political game and going back and forth, good cop, bad cop. Good cop, the Labour. No, their history says that's not true. And the bad cop being the Conservatives. Their history, well, definitely is not true either. But we've got this play out going on. And I'm fed up of the political parties. I don't trust them. When it comes to the election, I thought, who do I vote for? So I've stood. Because you need a personal person, an individual to go forth and be in Parliament and act and be a voice of Stafford and those 50,000 people that march for their NHS.
Thank you, Karen. On that note, I will hand over to Jeremy. Just before I do, actually, there is one further question which I think Jeremy is better placed to ask. It's coming from Morgan Tarr.
Why are cancer services being privatised 2 weeks before the general election?
So, Jeremy, to you, the overall situation with Stafford Hospital and obviously the NHS, and obviously feel free to reply to some of Karen's remarks there as well, but also the privatisation of cancer services here.
Thank you very much. Well, I share an awful lot of what both Karen and Kate have said over some of the aspects of this. It has been an incredibly difficult time. It continues to be an incredibly difficult time, and it will continue to be one. What I would just like to say in response to Paul's letter that he read out was, I believe very, very strongly that we must have confidence in the ability of all our hospitals, whether UHNS in Stoke or in Stafford, to provide good quality services. The people there, the staff there, they are as committed as people in Stafford, right across the NHS. I don't want to play one off against the other. Where I would agree is that we must play, you rightly pointed to the Francis report, we must make sure that the staffing levels, which were a problem down here, do not become a problem elsewhere. And there are real safeguards which should be in place across the NHS now to do that. And each hospital is required to look at the staffing levels and to make sure that they are up to the level that they consider to be safe, because the safety of patients is absolutely paramount. We have all been through a very long an extremely difficult time on this, and most of all patients and staff. The situation we have at the moment is not at all satisfactory. The situation we have is a minimum set of proposals from the TSA, which we have been promised will be implemented, but which I, as others, all of us, I think, on this table, believe to be inadequate, and particularly around children's services and maternity services. And I'll come on to that a little bit in a moment. But I just want to set a slightly broader picture. And I would say that the NHS as we know it is facing a huge crisis, and it's not so much around the politics of it. It's more about demography, about life expectancy, about a growing population, and about the finance that we commit to it. Yes, there is politics around how do you do things, whether you have CCGs, whether you don't have CCGs, and that plays right into our situation. But a much more fundamental question is, how are we going to increase the finance available to health and, I should say, social care services to meet the needs of the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, because I don't believe we can have things going on as they are at the moment. What we had up to 97 was an NHS which, and I will freely say this, was underfunded under a Conservative government. Labour took over, and from 2001 they increased resources into the NHS quite substantially. They raised national insurance rates, and not all of that, but certainly a big chunk of it went into the NHS, and we had a bit of a catch-up there. When the coalition took over in 2010, we saw we saw the health budget maintained in real terms, so it's gone up from 96 billion in 2009-10 to 108 billion in this year, 2014-15, which is roughly kept up with inflation. But as we know, medical costs and the ageing of the population need a little bit more than that. And we in the UK are still behind, if you like, our counterparts in France and Germany in the amount we spend on health. And we've got to address that issue. And political parties that don't address that issue, in my opinion, are not living up to the responsibility. I have certain ideas on that, but I won't go into that now because that's for another time. Coming to where we are in Stafford, I believe that the localism, the idea that putting the commissioning of services into local hands is, in theory, the right thing to do. But it's only the right thing to do if two things are there. Firstly, people are prepared to listen and prepared to adjust what they propose in the light of what local people say. But secondly, that we actually have the local resources to do it. Now, the way that the NHS funding works is that a place like Staffordshire receives one of the lowest amounts per, and has done for 20 years. Again, this goes across governments, one of the lowest amounts per head of any part of the country. And therefore, if you adopt that system, which is a system that's been in place for a long time, and you say that a place like Stoke-on-Trent gets a little bit more, a place like Wolverhampton gets even more than that, but in Staffordshire, we are one of the lowest. Inevitably, we're going to find that we struggle when we have so many competing demands. And that's a position that the CCGs in Staffordshire find themselves in. Now, I think there are other ways that they could have addressed this, particularly on paediatrics. Maternity is a very difficult issue. I am absolutely committed to seeing consultant-led maternity here. But if you read the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists' latest paper that they produced, they talk about small or smaller units as being 2,500 to 4,000 births a year, whereas we're at 2,000 going up, but not at the 2,500. And what they are saying is you need full-time, as far as possible, consultant care. And the problem that our smaller district general hospitals face in providing these services is that they have to marry up the availability of consultants, the availability of finance to pay those, with the number of births that they're likely to have. And that is, again, a question that we have to address as a National Health Service. We haven't had that. We haven't had that discussion. What we've had is various hospitals, including ours, around the country, if you like, being picked off one by one over many, many years. I mean, we heard this week about changes that are going on to A&E, for instance, where 2 A&Es have become critical urgent care centres in London. Eastbourne and Hastings are going through a decision as to where consultant-led maternity will be there in the future. What we need is a much broader approach which says, are we prepared? Do we value things like consultant-led maternity highly enough that we will say they will be here, they will be there, they will be there? Or are we just going to leave it to local health economies, which are too weak in terms of finance, which we are, to support those? So these are really big questions. Now, I will continue along with the all-party and no-party campaign that we've been having to make this case very, very strongly here. I just want to turn to the question of the cancer and end-of-life services. I oppose this tender. You're absolutely right. It's not correct to have a decision 2 weeks before a general election. I've made that quite clear. And I've asked for the whole thing to be suspended. I know UHNS, who are the major provider of acute cancer services in our area, do not believe that this is the right thing to do. They have put their names forward in the tender, which I believe they had no option but to do, because they need to have their names in the frame should it go ahead, which, as I say, I hope it doesn't go ahead. What I think we need to do is ensure that all the work that Macmillan Cancer Care have done together with the CCGs, talking with patients who have cancer, talking with patients who are experiencing the wonderful end of life care that we have in our county, that all that information about the need to have better coordination in some areas is not lost. It's not just thrown out if we don't go ahead with this tender. But I absolutely agree, and I've raised it again this week in the House of Commons. I have said that I don't believe that this is the way forward. We must suspend it. What we need to do is we need to try with coordination between the existing bodies, and I believe that will work, and we will see there's no need to put it out to a third party.
Thank you, Jeremy. Obviously, we're live at the moment. We are taking in questions from listeners at home. Jan Kelly, I believe, on Facebook has posed a question just to Jeremy and Kate. I'll ask you to be quite concise with your answers if you can. How do you feel about the Conservative and Labour MPs, both sides, voting for the Health and Social Care Bill, and how are they? How far will they toe the party line? Because Labour too have had a hand in dismantling the NHS. To you, Kate.
I think your correspondent might be mistaking Labour for the Lib Dems. When the Health and Social Care Act was passed, Andy Burnham came out and said they may think this is the end of the NHS, but it's the start of our campaign. Labour Party supporters were outside Parliament holding a minute's silence together with all of the unions, and Lib Dem and Tory MPs were inside banging on the cabinet table as they got it through, because they saw it as the central element of the Conservative programme. So that's what the Tories think. What Labour think is, let's get it done today. We've used Clive Efford's private members bill, which is coming through in November, and we've said to the Lib Dems, come on, acknowledge this was a huge mistake. Acknowledge it has not been good for the NHS, and the NHS is on the brink of destruction. Vote against it now. Let's get the Health and Social Care Act done. And then when we come in, we'll move on from there. If they won't partner with us in that, and if we can't attract people like Jeremy to cross the floor and say this was a mistake and we regret it, then on our first day in power next year, we will have this act done and we will consign it to history.
Jeremy, would you consider crossing the floor?
In terms of things on the Health and Social Care Act, I think there are some things in it which absolutely need to be changed, and I have no hesitation about saying it. I think the TSA process is completely wrong. There's a review going of the TSA process at the moment, and let's not forget this. The TSA process was introduced initially under the previous 2006 Act for non-foundation trusts and by our government for foundation trusts. Both Lewisham and Stafford have shown that that process is not the right way. It's a financially driven process masquerading as a clinically driven process. It's absolutely not right. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, and there's a real issue here about, and I've referred to it already, about local decisions. I believe that it's very important for decisions to be taken locally, but it is very difficult to take decisions locally when you are, as I've said in the case of Staffordshire, constrained by budgets which are vastly, or not vastly, that's an exaggeration, substantially lower than in other parts of the country per head. We see the same in education. We're the second lowest funded, as from next year, county in the country on education. Yet, of course, we pay the teachers the same wages, apart from those in London who get London waiting allowance. People in Staffordshire, health professionals in Staffordshire, quite rightly, are paid the same as they are in other parts of the country. I absolutely resisted any attempt to have regional pay for health workers, because I don't believe in that at all. But what that means is we are under pressure, and therefore you cannot have, it's all very well giving power locally to commissioners, but if you don't then give them the same resources across the country, you are asking them to make extremely difficult decisions. So let's not be under the illusion that just changing the law or reversing parts or all of a law is going to be a panacea. It is not. What is going to be a panacea is a much fairer system of funding, both the overall amount of funding that goes into the health and social care system, and also the way it's divided up across the country.
I won't provide a question to you, Karen, as the listener hasn't. But you can touch on it in the next topic if you like. I'm going to move back to local issues. Obviously, the hospital is quite a major issue, and we were going to spend a lot of time on that. We do just have a few minutes remaining, but do want to talk about some of the other issues that are coming up. It's mainly around infrastructure in Stafford as a town. Just to read some of the questions that are coming from listeners. Staffordshire County Council are appealing against proposed new housing development in Nosal, and so the listener wanted to ask the question: are we building enough houses? Also, what are the panelists' view on the proposed closure of the Nosal swimming pool? Obviously, we touched a lot on the healthcare system, but will our education and healthcare system be able to cope with the influx of military personnel coming into the town? And further to that as well, what would the panelists like to see happen in tackling the crippling congestion in Stafford? Now, as I say, we've only got a couple of minutes each on this, if that's okay. But to you, Karen, first, if that's okay.
Yeah, on the housing side, I mean, this is all with the planning laws changing in 2012, and what we're actually seeing is protection for our countryside, sort of less so, and the ability to do that. And, you know, at times as well, you're seeing sort of developers just taking the councils and that to court in order to win a case and then get their way, really, and build these wonderful developments. So housing, I do think we ought to protect our greenfield sites. We should look at other places to build within towns and areas and make use of, you know, sort of reclaim land. And I know they're doing that, but I think there has to be an active movement. So I quite understand the concerns in Nosal. I'll just touch as well on the swimming pool. In Nosal, I mean, I think it's terrible, actually, that they're losing a really good community facility. It's quite easy. I've been involved in developments of large buildings, complex buildings for elderly as well, and for the extra care schemes. And very often, you know, we put in swimming pools when initially they weren't designed. Quite easy to do. It's not just about the children when you build a facility like that. It's the community. It's the elderly. A lot of people, when we've got care for the elderly in the community, one of the big preventative factors is actually swimming, getting elderly to swim. They love it. It's aspect like with residents who had dementia. We took a group of residents with dementia to our swimming pool, and that's a sort of regular event now. If you're promoting sort of health, if you're promoting the economy, by default you're promoting people's lives, and you're doing a lot of preventative work and improving people's lives. So that actual swimming pool should remain in Nosal. It's a community facility, and we mustn't forget a lot of people do not have transport in the Staffordshire area. There's around 40%, a third of them do not have transport, and this is the problem we face. So keep it local, very local, and don't take away a facility that actually adds good health, well-being and mental health for a community.
Jeremy, to you about the local infrastructure issues and those particular issues around Nosal.
Yes, Nosal isn't actually in my constituency, so, but I know that Bill Cash, in whose constituency it is really fighting on the swimming pool. The issue of the housing has come up just this week. I was just speaking to him this morning, and I know that he takes that very seriously. So listeners who are concerned about that can contact Bill about those. But more generally, if we talk about the congestion and infrastructure and then housing, firstly, on housing, we need more housing. There's no doubt about it. The borough has got a plan for 11,000 new homes or so over the next 20 years, which I believe is about right. What I don't want to see is lots of speculative development in places which aren't in the plan. The whole point about a plan is you build your infrastructure around it. What we've been seeing, and fortunately the plan is in place so they can be resisted, is speculative developments. But we also need to build the right kind of housing. I want to see more housing that's more suitable for people who want to move in as perhaps they get older, single-storey housing. We're told by developers that's too expensive, it takes up too much land. I disagree. I've written a letter this week to one developer asking them to put many more of these homes, because those are what my constituents are asking for. In turn, they would move out of 3-4 bedroom homes and free those up. Finally, on roads, yes, we do have a real problem with congestion. One thing we have to face in Stafford is our geography. We have two rivers, Canal 3 railway lines. It is difficult to do a great deal about that because we don't want to knock down lots of houses to build roads. Absolutely not. What we need to do is firstly look at pinch points. I take a couple of examples on Western Road where we've got the turn off to the hospital, which has improved things. We've got the roundabout at Blackheath Lane. Smaller things like that can really help. We also have the Western Access Road, which we've just secured funding for, which will help. It won't be at all a panacea for congestion, but it will help, and it will also help with the areas around Burley Fields where more housing is due to be developed. But we also then have to look at more smarter ways of travel, more public transport. It's something that's been neglected over many years. I think we need to look at more investment in that. It's very difficult in the current climate, but I think we need to take a long-term view on that, and also smarter ways of working, possibly slightly staggering times in which the major businesses open or schools open, as they do in other parts of the country. Even a few minutes can make a big difference to congestion at certain times.
Thank you, Kate, and to you, just to let you know, we aren't going to stop at 9 o'clock. We are going to carry on for another 10 minits or so afterwards. We've been given permission to do that. So to you about the infrastructure issues.
Well, I'm really happy to do that. Can you just scroll up so I can see
Oh, sorry, yes. So the issues around proposal, the proposed housing, the swimming pool closure, and also the impact on the health education systems and traffic.
I feel like I can expand myself now and answer the questions properly in all of them. Actually, I'd like to start with a suggestion. I think there's obviously a huge appetite for this, so we should try and make it a regular thing. Sorry, we should try and make this a regular occurrence. Secondly, an offer. These questions, we should have the answer to them at our fingertips. We should know exactly what we want Stafford's future to be. If you want to give me the list of questions afterwards, all the ones that we didn't get answered, I'll give you a paragraph on each over the weekend, and you'll know exactly what Labour's stance on each of them is. So starting with, do we build enough houses as a country? Of course we don't. We don't build anything like enough houses as a country. We've got a backlog of nearly 3 million homes that we need to provide for people. The standard of housing in this country is really declining rapidly. We have the weakest tenancy protections in Europe for people who are in rented accommodation. Now, I hope I don't look all that old. I'm in my early 30s. When I became old enough to buy a home, it took people on average 3 years to save enough money for a deposit. It now takes 30 years to save enough money for a deposit. And that's partly because people are struggling, but it's partly because house prices have gone up because they are a rare commodity. Now, I bought my first home this year at 34. It's a tiny one up, one down terrace, but someone like me, with my forecast earnings within the charity sector, it's very unlikely that if I were coming out of university now, I would ever be able to afford a home. That's how bad it is. Now, I spent last summer volunteering on something called the Lions Commission, which is Labour's look at housing and our view on what policies we're going to bring forward. And some of the policies I think are pretty relevant to Stafford. But having just said how much I value housing and also construction, because that's the industry I'm from, and a third of jobs that were lost in this country over the economic crisis were in construction and related industries, I'm a big believer in construction infrastructure. That doesn't mean that I think our housing plans in Stafford are right. We've got 50,000 homes in Staffordshire Borough Council area. We're building 11,000 more. We are not looking at the roads. We are not looking at the infrastructure. There's a question here about access to healthcare and childcare. We're not putting those things in place. So how can we build the homes to go along with them? If you look at the traffic plan for Stafford, it is entirely focused on getting people from the suburbs into Tesco's and out back again. There's very little being done on getting people around the town. You know, we are becoming a town which is isolated by the congestion. Now, I've got some really practical ideas on that, and I'll be happy to put them down on paper, but I do want to make sure that I deal with the rest of the questions. But going on to why Bill Cash is fighting housing developments in NOSAL when we really do need housing, because it's in NOSAL. Because if you look at the plan and you look at where the housing is going, it is all in Stafford town centre. The villages are really being let off on this. And you know why? It's because that's where Conservative voters are. Now, that's not fair planning and it's not fair policy. And if you look at the houses that are being developed and you look at the Western Road, it's got more to do with estates, with residential construction, than it does to do with relieving congestion in this very congested town. So what's our answer? Well, we think we need to talk to developers a bit more. There is a lot of land banking, and the only way that we will reach Labour's target to get 200 new homes built every year is by saying to developers, sorry, Your profits are rocketing at the moment. It's time you stepped up a bit. When we look at the proposed route for new roads in Stafford, let's not look at it with a sense of how many more estates can we build in the next 2 years. Let's look at it as what's better in the town in the long term. And now let me look at that other question about NOSL and swimming pool. Now, my mum's a primary school teacher, and she knows a little bit about this because she's been involved. What we used to do with building schools is we would get a local architecture firm in and we'd say to them, what's the best design for this school? What's the best design for this plot? What's the best design for the kids? And the reason that they're rebuilding in NOSL is because they're taking that school up from 210 to 310 pupils. So that's a good thing. But the problem is that when Michael Gove came in, he said, I think that's wasteful. What I want is a basic design for schools. I want a sort of cookie cutter Lego pattern, and we'll just drop it onto every school site. So at St Lawrence's, they wanted to build the school down one end of the site and to keep the swimming pool. And that's a really important thing because swimming's part of the national curriculum. It's good for our kids. It's a really important skill. It saves lives. But the school weren't allowed to do it. And to me, that's really unfortunate. And actually, there is something that Bill Cash could be doing on this. He could be saying, let's take it out of the cookie cutter programme and let's fund a more interesting design, and then you solve your problem in one go.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you. I believe Paul Wilson, who's the original proposer of the question round Stafford Hospital, would like to say something.
Yes, thank you. I'm struggling with the notion that hospitals seem to be going to be persuaded by big private conglomerates to cut their prices. I'm not quite sure what that means. Could Kate explain?
Yeah, sure. Very happy to. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so the privatisation, I haven't really had the chance to speak on this, but it's honestly 60% of my time at the moment is devoted to this because it is a privatisation which is the biggest privatisation in NHS history, the first ever £1 billion privatisation in NHS history. It is being rushed through to complete 2 weeks before the next election. There is not an oncologist in Staffordshire that supports it, and UHNS are very anxious about this. They've had to bid to keep these services within the NHS. But the reality is that they are not going to get the contract because they are not a financial services organisation. So what happens? Cancer patients will still go to the same providers. UHNS will still treat cancer patients. But the private company that is awarded this contract, and it's the CCG because it's always the CCG that's determined to rush things through, they will have the ability to negotiate with UHNS, and they'll be able to say, well, we've got to make some money out of this. And even Andy Donald, the head of the CCG, says that's why these companies are interested in the contract, because they see an opportunity for profit. So where's our 10% going to come from? And they will be able to turn around and say, we can decommission. We don't want these services anymore. We don't want nutrition. We don't want social support. They'll be able to say, we don't want to pay this much. And that's what we know about. What a doctor who works at UHNS came up to me and said the other day is, if an external company, and it will be a Virgin or a Ramsay Health or one of these big privatising companies, if they are in charge of what's being bought, how do we work with multidisciplinary care, which is at the centre of cancer care, and how do we deal with surgery? Are we going to have Virgin writing into us to say we would like to use time in your surgery suite? And if so, what happens if it's a more complicated case than they thought? Do they have to go back and say, do you want us to proceed? What criteria are we using? And the reason that the CCG can't answer any of these questions at the moment is because they will write the contract after it has been awarded. And to me, that's scandalous. And when the contract has been awarded, it will be awarded for a 10-year term. There's no procurement organisation in this country that would spend £1 billion with no break clause over a 10-year term and think that was appropriate. So one of the key things for me over the next 9 months will be to get this cancer privatisation delayed. And then if I'm your MP next year, I will put a red line through it.
Thank you. Just very finally, we are running out of time now.
Could I
with the extension? Yeah, Jeremy,
come
please.
back on that? Because I think it's very important to point out that this is something which I think all of us here are absolutely at one on. We don't believe that this is the right way to go at all. We believe that the cooperation with the existing bodies who are providing those services is the way to go. There are problems that have to be dealt with. I have constituents who come to me and make it quite clear that although they think the cancer care they receive is excellent, the coordination leaves quite a lot to be desired. there are things we have to do, but this is absolutely not the way to go. And I want to see that contract out. It is not the solution.
We do have one final question, and I'll come back to it if we have time. But in the meantime, Karen, is there anything you'd like to add further?
Well, I think it's appalling, and it leads to, when you look at everything from health in your care pathways, they are a vital part of it. But you also need proper resources for that, and that's about staff, that's about district nurses. I don't know if you realise there's a huge shortage in district nurses occurring nationally as well. And my father died recently of cancer, and we were subject to one of these care pathways. And it was a district nurse who actually did all the coordinating and actually was the signposter. So this fragmentation that's going on will also lead not just to that. It's a very expensive way to do things. There's been a recent report where, going down on this marketisation, including this internal market aspect that we have, and this fragmentation, it's going to be about 15% of administration costs. Well, if you haven't got that process happening, it's going to be about 6%, which actually makes a big difference. So this is a very expensive way of going about it. But as usual, CCG hasn't consulted us, have they? And that's what continually happens.
Thank you, Karen. We have sort of a minute and a half left. There is a final question. I'm going to rephrase it slightly to get a kind of one-word answer out of each of you, really. The final question actually is around the Scottish independence votes happening next week. The question originally was, what impact will that have? I suppose the question actually should be, will it have an impact on Stafford? To you, Jeremy, first.
Yes, it will. If the vote is yes, and certainly I speak personally, I'm passionate for the union. I want to see Scotland stay with us. I don't want to see them leave. We have family. We have all of us have connections, friends, family right across the UK. But in terms of economically, it will have an impact, and in many other ways, it'll have an impact both in Scotland and in the rest of the UK.
Kate.
In macro terms, very little. There's a bit around Stafford's. We could have a really strong feature here around logistics, because we're exactly the point where you can get from the north of Scotland to Stafford in a single driving shift. So that's a little bit of our local feature that would be affected. But my main comment on the Scottish thing is that this has been so badly handled. And if I was in Scotland and I lived in Aberdeen at a Marines base for a while there, if I were being told that this is how much you get from the UK and this is how many fish and chip suppers it is for your family, I'd be tempted to vote yes just out of sheer annoyance.
And Karen, very, very quickly, you've got about 15 seconds.
Well, I think a lot of English people will be looking around and saying, I mean, it's easy to get rid of this bunch that we've got in the UK. And I think they'll be heading there. So I have some sympathy there, because they have got an NHS, they have got their public services, they have got also students that don't pay these huge loans as well. So yes, I can understand, but it would be a very sad thing and a big legacy for the Conservative government if they lost the United Kingdom.
I'd like to thank all our guests tonight. We will hopefully do this again sometime very soon. Thank you for joining us.